We have switched the recording on. I am stopping the transcription, but we are now recording, and we trust that you are all agreeable. My name is Luci Abrahams from the Link Center, and I'm welcoming our author for today, Russell Southwood. I'll say a little about Russell in a moment. And he's going to talk about his book, well, I should say his latest book, because there may be others, Africa 2.0, Inside a Continent's Communication Revolution. And I think about the book, every book has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning of the book is sort of like the Big Bang of the universe. And the middle of the book is where things really start evolving, and we're not quite sure what direction things will go in. There are some successes and some failures. And as in all evolution, things die, right? They don't continue, and some new branch of evolution takes over. And then we get to, and maybe it's a bit premature to say that this is the beginning of the end of the communications revolution, but it is sort of the ever expanding universe. This is where we just keep expanding like a balloon, and we go in not just one or two directions, but many directions. And I think that's what we're going to talk about with Russell this afternoon. So Russell Southwood is the CEO, founder, and CEO of Balancing Act. And I'm sure many of us have come across Balancing Act, or we've had, emails pushed into our mailbox from Balancing Act over more than a decade, in which we're told the story of this communications revolution. And now we can read it all in one book. So, Russell, with those few words of introduction, please do take a seat. You can kick us off then with the beginning, the Big Bang.
Okay, what I wanted to explain really was that this revolution thus far has had a kind of 35-year arc. So it's quite a long time. It's actually, we always think of technology as things that happen very quickly, but actually, sorry, we're just adjusting the lighting. That's it, that's much better. Great. So as I was saying, this is a 35-year history, and actually we think of technology as something that happens very quickly. People are launching products, and they launch them in 3 months and in 6 months and so on and so forth. But actually people's relationship with technology, what academics would call the appropriation of technology, which to translate is how they fit technology into their lives, not the other way around, is actually something that is...
Carry on. Ignore me.
Is something that actually is the thing that is most important in this history. So what it does is it goes from the beginning of the mobile revolution, it moves on to the breaking of the monopolies around the fiber infrastructure, so both the international and national monopolies, and then moves through to mobile money, and it looks at how the mobile internet came about, and through into all of the things, as Lucy has described later on, that actually open out the road, open out into the expanding universe. And that includes things like startups, the use of these kinds of technologies for development purposes. So all of those kinds of things. Now, when I thought about this book, I think what is interesting is, I don't know whether you had a song when you were young. For me, it was Aretha Franklin's Chain of Fools, and I have particular memories about that. And the moment it happened, I thought, I've never heard music like this. And that was just a thing. And now I'm, however many decades later, I know about her relationship with her father. I know about gospel music. I know about her involvement in the civil rights movement, her problems with drugs, her problems with weight. So you have a whole history and context. And this, in a way, is me trying to provide a whole history and context to the communications revolution. Because if you, I don't know how old any of you are, but if you remember back to sub-Saharan Africa in the 1980s, it was a fairly grim place. apartheid was still in place, and therefore that created a series of problems for a whole series of countries across Southern Africa. You had many people like Mobutu Sese Seko, who were dictatorial figures who wasted money on a lavish scale. And in a way, what happened was that this communications revolution began to change those things. And I'll try and describe how and why in a moment. But when we look back, if in 20 years' time there is a very, very different Africa, and there's already a different Africa from the 1980s, we will point to this as having been the start of those changes. So communications really is something that is wider than just communications, because it's impacted on people's lives, it's impacted on how countries are run, and it's impacted on what people can do. And that's the argument of the book, really. It's about people, and it's about how technology has empowered and enabled people. And if Africa is to have a different future, it is partly the doors that these technologies and what people have done with them have opened up.
So Russell, you say people, and that's a crucial starting point. You mentioned so many people, but you mentioned the people who really stand out from particular African countries. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about those people? Because the book kind of suggests that it was really difficult getting started, and without a few people who kind of did the right thing at the right time.
Absolutely.
The internet there wouldn't have been a Big Bang.
Yes, yes. I think the key thing that really lit the fuse for what you describe as the Big Bang was a combination of liberalization and privatization. Liberalization meant in the days before mobile, if you wanted to get a fixed phone line, you filled in a form, you had to get two people to sign it. You might wait up to a year. Telephone companies, one of the telephone companies had an 80-year waiting list. So you can, and then liberalization came along and delivered mobile phones. You could walk into a shop, and within 15, 20 minutes, you could walk out and be talking on your phone. So it kind of just broke it open in many ways. And the demand was so great that in Congo Brazzaville, for example, Celtel opened an operation there. They opened the doors of the shop, and something like 1,000 people turned up. And they had to call the police eventually to kind of control the crowd. People wanted this so badly that actually they almost beat the doors down. Every mobile operator set themselves sometimes quite modest targets and exceeded those targets usually within months. They would say the target is for year 1, and it will be exceeded in year 3 or year 4 or whatever. So in a way, it absolutely cracked open some of the controls that seemed to be in place in those kinds of countries. If you could transfer information, if you could communicate with each other, then actually you began to change people's circumstances. One of my great favorites is the story that I found when looking at the Celtel as a mobile operation. There was a woman in Sierra Leone who had a mobile phone. She was pregnant, and she had to get to the hospital quickly. So she used her phone to be able to get in touch with her husband. Husband came back. It was a complicated pregnancy. So complicated, she almost lost the baby. And as a result, the baby was born, and she called the baby Celtel. And so, and mobile phones were put on the material, the Ghanaian fabrics, because it has been a cultural and social phenomenon. It's not just an economic phenomenon. It is bedded into people's lives. Part of my history is during the 60s, and during the 60s, what all testosterone-fueled males wanted was a sports car. If you like, the mobile phone is the sports car for these decades. But the great thing about it is it's substantially cheaper than a sports car. Everybody can have one. Everybody can aspire to one. Everybody can aspire to the next one up. And so what the mobile phone did was create a level of aspiration, because the mobile operators were publishing these billboards, together a better future, tomorrow better, and all of these things. You didn't have to believe the mobile operators. They just happened to arrive at a good time. But people would look at this and think, yes, maybe there is a better world. Maybe something good can happen. And the mobile operators put a considerable amount of investment in. So if we take the example of MTN Nigeria, when it turned up, it employed 300 people. Of those 300 people, 80 were white South Africans. So roll forward now, 19,000 people are employed by MTN Nigeria. And I would doubt that 80 people were expats. So what that means is that all the skills required to run a company of that kind have been, if you like, landed back in Nigeria. And not only that, if you look at investment, the first investment is all mining oil, digging stuff out of the ground. Now that stuff doesn't really require great skills except at a management level, whereas this really does. This requires an enormous amount of skills. And so what has happened in these successive waves of investment is that money has been brought into the continent, but it's not money that has done nothing, it's money that has gone into creating skills and activities. One of the side effects of mobile operators and the money they've put in is the fact that mobile operators had to advertise. Because they had to advertise and they were the biggest advertisers, they spent money with the newly privatized broadcasters and broadcasting grew. Likewise, the mobile operators encouraging digital activity encouraged digital agencies. So all of this stuff cascades outwards in a way that mining investment doesn't really cascade outwards. It stays around the mine, really. So that's the way in which this has, in a way, come in and changed things.
So just to let everyone know that everyone in the room, all the audience online are seeing full screen, seeing Russell full screen. We have him with us. He's not only full screen, he's live. So no problem. So Russell, and I'm happy for anyone else to frame a question. Maybe we start getting into the middle era, middle of this revolution.
I think one of the pivot points was the move into people trying to make sense of the internet. And whilst mobile voice was complicated at the beginning because you had to break down these barriers and you had to fight the government telecoms company, which didn't want really to see any of this happen. Internet was really, really complicated. You know, you set up a mobile network, you give somebody a phone, you don't have to explain much really. You press the buttons, you put it to your ear and hello Sabiso, how are you? And you know, it's terribly simple. It works. Internet wasn't. First, you had to connect to the internet. Secondly, you had to find a way out of the country, and the monopoly operators generally controlled that. So the price was very high. If you were in the country, then you had to pay for a long distance call to access the internet. So it was again doubly expensive. So having broken that down, you then had to have an international cable to connect you to the rest of the world. The first one of those that was built was called SAT3, which was built at the behest of Telkom, really, South Africa's Telkom. And it was a monopoly, and it meant that the prices were, originally something like $12,000 per megabit per second. And they are now, $5 and below. So you can see, it was a gateway. And more cables came to be built. I mean, your colleague in the room here from CCOM was built as a private cable. It faced tremendous opposition, but broke that down. And as a result, more and more cables were built along the East Coast. Having built those cables, you've got it into the country. You've then got to find a device which is sufficiently cheap and content which people will find interesting. And an enormous amount of effort went into trying to get a handset, a smartphone or a feature phone that was $50 or below. And it took several years to do that. But that alone wouldn't do it. And the content that slowly, well, not so slowly actually, made people connect with the mobile internet in Africa was a combination of Google search, YouTube, and Facebook. So that provided the content. And there was something about Facebook which African users liked because it was social in the way that they were social. And you've got to communicate with your family, you want to know a bit of news, you want to see what the fashion is, and you could do all that. And it wasn't as complicated as having to set up a website. So that got you through to the start of the internet.
And what's really interesting in the book is that you shed light on what happens in particular countries. There's certain countries, particularly countries in West Africa and North Africa, that stopped getting very involved with the mobile revolution and the internet. And, you couldn't tell the story of all African countries, but you did tell a little bit of insight into some of those countries. Could you maybe shed some light on that?
I chose sub-Saharan Africa. I didn't deal with North Africa at all because North Africa is very different. It's really part of the Arab-speaking world and part of the Middle East to some extent. There are 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and of those, there is reference to and some coverage of 44. So as much as I could, I've tried to cover the whole of that area. And it's very complicated because countries are very different. Sao Tome and Principe is a country of a few 100,000 people, and DRC is 88 million people, and Nigeria, on and on you go. There are all sorts of differences of climate and language, the 2,000 plus languages and so on and so forth. I personally visited 27 of these countries, so I have some familiarity. I don't pretend to be a great expert on countries, but I have some familiarity. And that was very important because actually you don't understand this story simply by telling it from one or two countries. There's quite a lot of coverage of Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Ghana maybe, but actually to try and understand the differences between what happened in the continent, I think are particularly important, between what happens in Anglophone countries and Francophone countries, and between Francophone and Lusophone, the Portuguese-speaking countries like Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde and places like that. So to understand all the nuances and the differences between countries is particularly important. Because again, those are cultural. And when we come on to the startup stuff, it's very striking how at the beginning of startups, it was the Anglophone countries. It was South Africa, it was Kenya, it was Nigeria that got to doing startups much more quickly than Francophone Africa. So there was some cultural difference there. And in South Africa, the level of people involved in startups relative to other countries, and Tanzania versus Kenya relative, if you compared how many people are involved in it, you can see that some cultures are appear to be much more entrepreneurial, appear to be much more opportunity oriented. And so that was of interest to me, because I think many of these issues are cultural, not in the sense of arts, but cultural in the sense of how we live and how we behave, and why people in certain countries and certain ethnic groupings behave very differently to certain other ethnic groupings, and so on and so forth.
So that sort of raised. Yes, go ahead.
It was a message there saying that they struggle to hear you because you're.
Maybe I should.
Yeah.
Fine, but
so we're having a moment while Lucy is coming nearer so that you can hear her.
Right. So then, Russell, maybe share with us a few of those stories from the particular country, so Ghana, Senegal, because those were countries in West Africa, for example, who really pushed that button.
Yeah.
Any sort of specific stories from those countries?
I think what is particularly interesting is how the startup revolution starts, and it starts to some extent both in Ghana and in Kenya. You have a situation where there were startups before the internet started. There was Mark Shuttleworth here who sold his company for a lot of money. There was something called Africa Online, but they were sort of in spite of the circumstances. Whereas in 2009, I think it was MEST started in Ghana and iHub started in Kenya. And what you had was a circumstance in which the people who started that suddenly found themselves with a community of several thousand people, all of whom wanted to do something with the internet. And you've gone from a circumstance where, the founder of Africa Online said to me when he started he bought Africa Online back from the States to, in a sense, come back to Africa and to Kenya. People didn't have skills. People weren't connected. They didn't know anything really, to a situation now where people are much better informed, understand far more. And one of the women who was involved in investing in Kenya said she arrived, I think, in 2005, and somebody said to her, "Can you start a technology fund in Kenya?" And she said, "I looked around and there was hardly anybody there." Now, it's not been easy for those people who are doing startups. We tend to have this kind of heroic image of startups as if somehow, it's kind of, you battle your way through and all the rest of it. I give in the book the story of Ken Njoroge, who's launched Cellulant, which is a payments platform. And he starts his day, he comes into the office, he finds all of his staff are being arrested. And he himself is suddenly arrested. He is running essentially music streaming, and the Copyright Society of Kenya, which is very dodgy, has said to the police, arrest these people because they're doing illegal things. And they'd stopped using the Copyright Society of Kenya precisely because they were very dodgy. So they're thrown in jail. And, he explains that, we may be small dogs, but the big dogs don't like to be bitten. So actually, after a time when they weren't prepared to pay their way out, they were let go. Now, what he did was go from having a music streaming, well, he started with SMS. He started with, value-added services. What's the football score? What's the religious thought of the day? Those kinds of things. Did music streaming. With music streaming, he thought there must be a better way to get things paid. So he set up a financial platform that interlinked banks and various payments people. And then Safaricom decided to launch its own music platform for free. So he was out of business. And so he went to setting up the payments platform and developing that. And he stepped back from the company recently. And before he stepped back from the company, a number of his staff died in one of the terrorist incidents in Kenya. And he joked that my wife used to say that Cellulant was one of her children, because she always lived with the ups and downs, and many times he couldn't pay his rent and so on and so forth. But what he has done is he has created a company which has several hundred people working for it, which brings new skills, which is growing, and therefore you have new possibilities, new opportunities. The people who work for that company will gain new skills and go on to do things themselves. Even if they don't go on to do things themselves, they will find better jobs and find better opportunities. So it's as Luci has described it earlier, it's a kind of cascade effect. Things lead on to things, lead on to things.
And, in the title of the book, there's the word inside. And in a sense, you're telling that inside story, because what we see, what we experience every day, well, we know Safaricom exists, we know Vodacom exists, and we, without thinking, we just use our mobile phones. But, let's take us a little bit deeper inside. We've spoken about some of the countries, some of the personalities, and I'm sure you can tell us more about some fascinating personalities. I always remember Nee Quaynor, for example.
Absolutely.
But maybe take us inside some of those companies.
I think what was interesting was that when I started out to do this, I was constantly talking to people in the industry. And at various points, I have been a kind of activist, and at various points, I've been an observer. And so through the process of campaigning against SAT3, I was an activist. We gathered together people in the private sector, in civil society, to say, these prices are too high, they need to come down, and so on and so forth. So through this kind of work that I've done, I knew lots of people, I knew lots of parts of the story, but I had to sort of sit down and say, what is it I do know and what is it I don't know? So I interviewed for the book 137 people. And what I wanted to do was actually say to them, why do you think the things happened the way they happened? And also to say, what did actually happen? Because we have this notion, for example, of M-Pesa in Kenya as being something that came out of Kenya. Whereas in fact, it had, like many successful things, it had many mothers. And what it was a kind of coincidental kind of constellation of things. So DFID, which is the British Development Agency, put in a little bit of money for a pilot, which was originally about microfinance. And Safaricom agreed to take this on. And when they were watching in real time this microfinance operation, in other words, all the transactions coming and going, they realized that the users actually wanted to use it for transferring money. So what had started as microfinance then became what we know today, which is a money transfer operation. And so you have M-Pesa is launched in something like 2008, if my memory serves me right. But a good 5 years before that, a mobile organization called Celtel had launched a similar thing, but it found it very, very difficult to make it work. People didn't trust it. So what they did, they ended up making it as a kind of business money transfer thing. And eventually when the company was sold, they sold this company off and it closed down. So what you can see here is this thing of behaviors take time to change, and behaviors, there's something about timing, there's something about people. Michael Joseph, for example, very kind of strong-willed man who ran Safaricom at that point, was responsible for pushing through M-Pesa. And if you'd said to him 9 months in, is this going to be successful? I think if in his heart of hearts, he might have said, well, hard to say. But actually what happened was that there was violence in one of the elections. People couldn't get out of their houses. So they were transferring money to their gardeners, their drivers, their whatever. And it began to grow. Not that it hadn't been growing, but the curve started to move up. So this is how at every point in the book, there is someone who has been crucial. Now, if you say M-Pesa in Kenya and it's successful there, you think, oh, that must be easy. Everybody wants this. And of course, they tried it everywhere else. You know, MTN and various people like that tried mobile money, and they couldn't understand it. They could sign people up, but people weren't using it. And they eventually employed a woman consultant called Jennifer Barraza, who explained that what you actually had to do was to spend quite a lot of time explaining to people what it was for. Also, what they were offering people was a mobile wallet. Now, most people, you know, in those days, if you said to them, you know, you say to a trader who has a kind of wodge of notes, you know, do you want a mobile wallet? Wallet, what? And so it took a while to get it right, but it has slowly but surely grown. I think the paradox is that most of the mobile money stuff is, cash in and cash out. So you have three categories. You have people who still use cash, who are still the majority. And you have people who use it for cash in, cash out. Now, why do they do that? If I send my grandma in the rural area money, she can't use digital money. There's not a spaza shop in you know, wherever it is in Limpopo that takes mobile money in digital form. So she has to have cash. But then there is a whole other group of people.
It's 17 hours.
Who actually want to use it in its fullest sense. So they have a wallet, they keep money on the wallet, they can do things like insurance on it, they can save on it, they can take loans like Safaricom's M-Shwari, which has been very successful. So you've built a whole set of things there. But not only that, you've not only had mobile money operators having these platforms as they've become, but there's a whole ecosystem has developed around it to connect both countries within Africa and within Africa to the rest of the world. Because one of the other big things that occurred was that the volume of funding from the diaspora, so Nigerians living in Houston, Nigerians living in London, Ghanaians, Cameroonians, whoever, or Lesotho miners working in South Africa, or Burkina seasonal plantation, cocoa plantation workers, were all sending money home. And actually these systems made sending money home cheaper. And the amount of money that comes back to Africa through those systems is actually more than it gets in development funding. So actually they're quite important. And a country like Somalia really wouldn't stand upright if it wasn't getting money from outside. So they changed the circumstance, changed what was possible. And so if the putative grandma I was talking about a moment ago has a medical emergency, she can ring her son or her daughter in Johannesburg, London, wherever, and within a very short period of time have the money and the means to solve that emergency. So it doesn't do everything, but it does a whole lot more than it did before.
So we go from mobile money to fintech.
Yes.
And fintech is itself a revolution.
Yes.
So there's the mobile revolution earlier, but a couple of decades earlier. And then this generates a fintech revolution, and possibly with this expanding universe, ever expanding universe, many other revolutions. You know, we're looking at the future of agricultural revolutions, for example. As many African countries, not South Africa so much, but other African countries really begin to adopt drone technologies and health systems and clinics and public health authorities in Rwanda and elsewhere begin to adopt drone and other technologies for transferring blood to remote rural areas and so on. So we see this kind of socio-economic revolution growing on the mobile revolution.
Let's take a step back with the agriculture one, because I think what is interesting is that the first of these the idea was you give farmers market information, they will find a better market for the produce they have and therefore do better. And there was some evidence in some cases that it worked, and there was quite a lot of evidence that it didn't. Also, the other side of it was you give them advice, and in the kind of rationalist mode of thinking that you do, give people advice, they will want to take it and they will farm better. Again, very mixed evidence, really. So in 2001, the first of these platforms was launched in Senegal by a guy called Daniel Anaros, called Manobi, the platform was. And here we are, how many years, what is that, 21 years later, and we're still in a situation where quite large numbers of people are having access to these platforms, but it's not necessarily having the same amount of impact that people thought it would. Now, why is that? Well, if you take somewhere like Kenya, everything is small plot farming. People are growing not for other people, generally speaking, but for themselves. So maybe half to 2/3 of the crop is actually for the family. And what they want to do is get rid of the rest of it. It's like if you grow vegetables in your garden, you have a sudden moment where all the tomato plants come out and you've suddenly got sort of, a kilo of tomatoes you need to get rid of very quickly. So that in a way, it's quite difficult to see how you change agriculture unless you change the fundamental circumstances. The other thing too is that farmers are what? Farmers, generally speaking, let's again take Kenya, they're older, much older. They are not always literate, or if they're literate, they're not highly literate. And if they're not highly literate, they're also not tech literate. This is the generation for whom tech is an imposition rather than something that comes as naturally as milk and water. So you're in a situation where actually many of those people are not the first people who would use a device of this kind. Now, I think this leads on to the second point, really, which is that if you think about how things are going to change, the generation that is 18 to 25 in Africa, in all the different countries, the digital natives, if you're 18 to 25 now, in 10 years' time, you will be in the foothills of power. And in 20 years' time, you will be in power. So you will have perhaps an African president who is 40 years old or 50 years old, who has been using Facebook or whatever the equivalent of Facebook is by then for 20, 30 years. So he doesn't need technical advisors, he needs other kinds of advice, better advice. And so there is something going on which will change over time. The demographics will change, the skills that people will have will change. And that will lead on to more of this ever-expanding universe.
So we've spoken about all the good stuff, but there's some bad stuff. Then there's some really bad stuff. And some of that relates to the minerals in the production of digital devices, not only mobile phones, but all other digital devices. Devices with chips and so on. And there are just those handful of countries in Africa where the 3TG and C minerals are mined. We have some really nasty stuff going, equivalent to what we saw in the movie Blood Diamond.
You have child labor. really.
Yes.
Yeah. And essentially these 3 million minerals are mined in a very uncontrolled way. And as a result, people are treated very, very badly. And yeah, this is one of the downsides, if you will, of this revolution. You know, and there will be more of it too, because, you know, if you want electric cars, if you want batteries, if you want all of those things, they require more of these kinds of minerals. So there are various initiatives to try and get a grip on it, but the difficulty is the countries in which they occur are countries that it's very difficult to get to the point where the rule of law is genuinely able to tackle the issues that are being talked about.
Yeah. So there are a few initiatives. There's something called the Responsible Minerals Initiative, and
yeah,
you know, they try their best, but they're relatively small.
Yeah, absolutely.
Limited impact. There's a professor at Harvard
Yeah.
who writes about the stuff, who's visited,
Yeah.
you know, Republic of the Congo and made this information known in public. And I think it's really important to balance the knowledge of the good,
Yeah.
the bad, and the really, really nasty. So
One-
Thabiso,
one of the chapters is about corruption and the telecoms industry. And because I wanted to root the book in the real life of the continent, it's not just about, you know, shiny technology, wow, it's all great, and all the rest of it. Now, all of us know that there is something that you can describe in a number of different ways. If you describe it academically, we would say patronage capitalism or rentier capitalism, where the friends of the president essentially get all the big shiny objects. So, you know, the president says, oh, there's going to be a car dealership, and you'll get the car dealership for the country. You know, there's going to be a hotel franchise for whatever the hotel is. Now, similar sorts of corruption went on around the beginning of the telecoms industry and continue today. And the leaks movement and the international consortium of international journalists have done great work, in a sense, shining a light on. I mean, the biggest and most outrageous case is Isabel Neto, who was the daughter of the former Angolan president, who essentially took control of a telecoms company called Unitel in Angola and took money out of it. And the shareholders could do nothing about it. You know, the shareholders had a case against her and so on and so forth. But that all began to unravel when the presidency changed, partly, I suspect, because the president wanted to get rid of everybody from the previous political era. And they've unusually taken all of it away from her. But huge sums of money, absolutely staggeringly large sums of money, were involved in that. And I think that if you have this kind of patronage capitalism where the economic opportunities in a country are quite limited, I think it's quite significant that what liberalization and regulators did wasn't bring down heaven on earth, but actually something quite simple, which was to actually occasionally give opportunities to people who weren't friends of the president. Now, I'm not saying that happens in every country. I mean, if you look at a country like Cameroon, I think all the telecoms operators have somebody who is associated with the president involved in them. But there are other countries where, you know, initially that was the case, and the road has widened. And the great thing about startups is that startups don't have to ask permission of the president or government to start. And therefore, you've got this little space which hopefully will begin to break down that kind of control, which will begin to make African economies much more lively, much more competitive, much more interesting. But you know, yes, that's a downside.
So Thabiso has a question, and you have a question. So Thabiso, just come a little closer and pose your question. Then Russell will respond, and then you come over, and then we'll have a few questions from people online.
Yeah, thanks, Luci. Thanks, Russell, for the book. Very interesting. You're talking just now about the corruption, and you spoke earlier about the mobile money, the rise of mobile money, and all of that. Now, there's always been also a sort of apprehension and antagonism. I don't know what to call it here. The way network operators have been perceived by some governments across the continent. Now, this has also led to the rise of traffic monitoring systems in many countries. So my question is, what is, is there efficacy to the systems? Are they, those governments that have implemented this traffic monitoring systems, have they been proven right? Have they found something that they were suspecting that the systems have proven, well, here it is, the network operators were underreporting, were doing something illegal in terms of how they were reporting traffic and revenues and stuff like that. What also is behind the rise of this system? So the rise of these systems and the efficacy thereof. Thanks.
I want to take a step back and look at tax, because I think the thing about mobile operators, they generated such wealth that governments actually saw them as kind of easy pickings is probably the wrong word, but it gives you a flavor of it. Here's the golden goose. We can keep taking the eggs, and they're quite heavily taxed. And I think that that is not always a good thing. And you have quite sort of, the more you charge operators in taxes, some part of that, who knows what part, is passed on to the consumers. So you say you want a digital society, and a digital society in Africa has to have fairly cheap internet access, yet you're charging these people, and therefore they have to charge other people onwards, as it were. The thing about international call monitoring is very, very interesting, because in the old monopoly days, there used to be a single gateway, and governments love single gateways. It's all there, we can shut it down, we can look at what's going on there. And, whenever I did work on internet exchange points, and whenever you wanted to set up an internet exchange point in certain countries, you find myself talking to, the security person. And the security person would say, oh, this is, we want to be able to know what's going on. So the thing about liberalization is that there isn't a single point. The internet isn't a single point. It's many, many points. So that if it doesn't go that way, it can go the other way, because you want redundancy, you want all of that. I don't think that anyone necessarily has proven that actually the mobile operators were substantially underreporting, but it has provided a mechanism for tax. However, it had unintended consequences, because when it was done in Senegal, all the diaspora Senegalese turned up at the Senegalese embassy and demonstrated, because actually it was very, very expensive to call their folks back home. So you have to kind of see it through. You have to see all the aspects of that. And I think that if you want to see all the good stuff, you have to, in a sense, be able to step back. You have to kind of let go. And the problem is many of the regimes in Africa are big men, nearly all men, and it's a certain kind of power. And actually, it's a power with immense vulnerability. So somebody like Museveni in Uganda shuts down Facebook, shuts down the internet. Why? Because he's frightened. He's frightened that actually somebody will express an opinion that will go against his. Somebody was telling me an anecdote this morning about a 90-year-old woman in DRC who made a YouTube video that went viral criticizing Tshisekedi, the president. And she was arrested. A 90-year-old woman was arrested for making a YouTube video. So you can see that this is about something more than a tax. It's about control. It's about political power, political economy, and all of those things.
Please come forward and maybe just also your name and then your question.
Okay, so do I speak into the...
Yeah, no, you can just
sit there. Sit there.
Yeah. Okay, so my name is Piwe Chireka. And my question is whether it's covered in the book or not, but also just to get your viewpoint on the notion of digital human rights. And I like your last statement about how the internet shutdowns, the monitoring, etc. Is that something that you look at in your book? And also just because right now it is a headache, right? I think for any operator out there, and also I guess for us sitting on the other side, we tend to look at it, oh, these governments are crazy. I don't know if you can give us a view of where is it coming from, right? I know afraid is probably maybe one
A part of it.
part of it.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's got to be an official position, right, that they
Yeah.
come with, right? And it would be interesting to hear what that might be. And then also just to see how do we then move forward? Because now, at first it was an isolated incident in South Sudan, but now
Yeah.
every second week
Yes.
there's a, internet shutdown in Sudan, internet shutdown in Eswatini, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everywhere. So just to talk a bit more about
Okay.
digital human rights.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Again, I'm going to start by stepping back, because actually the phrase that runs through all of this, like Blackpool through a stick of rock, is the digital divide. And the digital divide is all the divides in a society rolled into one. And if you look at those divides, you have education. And I think the point I would make over and over again is that literacy is actually the key to accessing all these things. If you can't read, you can't use SMS or the internet. And if you are not tech literate, the Mozilla Foundation, we quote a study in the book from the Mozilla Foundation that found you needed to be able to do 50 plus different things in order to operate a smartphone. So tech literacy is not a trivial thing. It's learned behavior. And I come from Europe, and I've been using computers for a decade more before smartphones arrived. So all the language was familiar and so on and so forth. So that's tech literacy. You're also talking about language as well, because Africa, as I said before, has all these many thousands of languages. But if you look at Rwanda, French is spoken by 5%, English is spoken by 5%, but Kinyarwanda is spoken by everybody with some fluency. Difficulty with Kinyarwanda is, by and large, it's not a written language. So yes, I mean, there is a certain amount of official documentation and so on and so forth. You talk about Wolof. Wolof is the majority language of Senegal, but it's not the first language of the majority of the population. And also reading Wolof compared to reading French for those who are educated is quite difficult because they don't know all the words. So that again is another, if you like, it comes back to human rights in a way. These are all the places of inequity that people start from. If you're a woman, you are much less likely to use mobile internet. You are more likely to have your phone chosen by a man, and therefore, the patriarchy is something that, in a sense, imposes an inequity on those who are not men. So how does this relate to human rights? Well, you can see, France, sitting there in the front row, has done a book on a topic which is much close to my heart, which is, if you can't speak the language, if you can't get access to the device, if you don't know how to use it, how do you get all the good stuff? How do you get the media, which will make you better educated, that will let you know more, that will entertain you, that will educate you? How do you get all those things? So that, in a way, as much as the internet shutdowns, that is, if you like, the human rights issue. How do we ensure that all citizens have access to the fastest route to education, entertainment, all of those kinds of things? And the funny thing is that, and it's something that's always interested me, is that if you're in a rural area, at 6 o'clock when the sun goes down, there isn't a whole lot of entertainment. So actually, when people are surveyed, they tend to say education first, entertainment second. Actually, their real lived behavior is probably entertainment first and education second. That doesn't mean they think it's unimportant, but actually those two things are the top two things. And that's the good stuff and the devil's tunes. So, it's not always as it appears. And actually, the human rights issues around access and around equity and around all of those things are absolutely crucial, and quite often are forgotten, if you will. I think the internet shutdowns, frustrating though they are, and the actual number of them year by year, hopefully is small and will continue to shrink. It's not a sustainable position. If I'm the president of a country, shutting down the internet is really not a sustainable position. It's a bit like saying, well, we're going to shut all the highways or whatever. It's crazy. It's not long term. So how we transition out of that, I don't know. but you will, I'm sure.
So we have a hand, Thabo Makake. Please, you may unmute your audio, make your
Yes.
point or raise your question. And then we have a few comments or questions in the chat. So we'll go there next. But Thabo, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to find out what your view is about corruption in the DNS system in Africa.
I'll repeat the question. He's asking me about what I think about corruption in the DNS system. The DNS system
Yes.
is the way that the internet fits together, the naming and numbering system.
The naming system, yes.
Yeah. I don't really want to comment specifically on the particulars of that, because I think I'm not sure I'm sufficiently informed. I've had several quite purple emails come into my inbox from different parties, and it's fascinating. And I think one of the things you would say, if you look at corruption, is that you can't be surprised that in countries where corruption comes from the top, that you would not find it at lower levels. We've had controversies to do with startups like Flutterwave. Now, again, whatever the specifics are, and I don't want to speak to the specifics, they all go back to the same thing, which is certain kinds of behaviors. And those kinds of behaviors are rooted in, if you will, quite firmly in different types of African cultures. So if you take startups, you are in a position where you will know hustle culture. Hustle culture is, oh, I'm doing 2, 3 things at once to make money and so on and so forth. So you have startups who start up, and instead of focusing on a single startup, will be doing 2 or 3 different things, of which the startup is only one. Now, obviously, that is not necessarily going to be the best way of approaching getting a startup off the ground. And the attitudes that come with that probably don't help the circumstances. So I suppose the best I can say is that if you have corruption in the society at a level that is not just at the high ups, but actually goes out into the Wananchi, out into the people, then you can hardly be surprised that it's going to be there. I think the important thing that is dealt with, and it is clear that it's dealt with.
Thanks. Frans, please go ahead, and then I'm going to go to the chat.
Thanks, and thanks for giving us so much to think about. I am from journalism, right? And one of the big concerns in our world is the fact that the big international tech platforms are basically leeching money out of media economies. Advertising is going to Google and Facebook. It's all very far from South Africa and Africa. And jobs are lost, and the quality of information that people get suffers. I just wonder whether you've addressed that and what you.
I have a chapter in the book called The Digital Life, and one of the things it tackles is, if you like, how media operates in this new landscape. And it's quite difficult because there's a young Nigerian entrepreneur who started a tech platform called Tech Cabal. He had 200,000 regular users, but he couldn't make money off of the platform. So that means that, quite an important piece of media that would inform the tech industry couldn't happen. Now, why is that? Because actually the platforms like Google and like Facebook and so on and so forth rely on, in order to get money out of YouTube, you really have to be doing more than 1 million views. So actually what you're looking at is something that is actually mass market. It's very bad with niche publications, very bad with sort of focused audiences and communities. And they will all respond, yes, but you can go and become an influencer. And well, actually, what is an influencer? An influencer is somebody who's paid to sing the song of a particular brand. Now, that's not very helpful, really, is it? And they often don't declare it. And so I think it's very tough to actually see how that can change, because I think that both Facebook and Google have been vampiric. They have sucked the oxygen out of different kinds of media. Something like the Financial Mail and Guardian is now making money out of events, not out of journalism. And if that's the case, that's not going to be good for the society. And that over time, I think the model has to change, because it's very similar to me when the model started with SMS in mobile operators. It was the mobile operator took 70 to 80% of the income. And over time, that has changed, in the other direction. And I think we really need to see some change in the balance of power between the big tech platforms and media.
Russell, I'm going to ask you to scoot over a little bit.
Sure.
So that I can come and manage the chat.
Yep.
Let's see what our online audience would like you to comment on. Okay. So let's maybe start from the bottom and go up. Gabriel says, cell phones or mobile smartphones are the major instruments to bridge the digital divide in the African continent. So internet shutdown is indeed its violation of human rights. I think you've already commented about that.
It's a statement, not a question.
We'll
but a good statement.
We'll go ahead.
Yeah.
And Salma Philemon from Windhoek says, looking at the digital divide, which is still an issue in most parts of Africa, versus the current emerging age of data, what are your thoughts on the kind of policies that can aid countries to start off or to get onto the right footing with regards to data as a currency? Thank you for that, Salma.
I think it's interesting because we tend to think of the digital divide as something that is particular to countries in what used to be called the third world, the term not used very frequently now, but in poorer countries. Whereas in fact there is a digital divide in my own country, in the UK. And I've done a talk with somebody who is a South African called Lauren Kahn about the differences and the similarities between the digital divide in UK and in Africa. And of course, Africa is completely different, but there are some similarities. There are similar themes and issues. I think the thing of data as a currency is kind of interesting because it takes you to, at the moment, something like $5 to $6 billion is being invested in data centers. And one of the big regulatory issues is about local data laws. So in other words, if you're a bank, the data for the bank should not be held outside of the country, which means that you have to have a data center that can support that data and so on and so forth. I think part of the shift that I was talking about with Franz was that somehow people have to be in a situation where they consciously control their own data, so that people have to ask you permission to whether you want to have your data used by somebody. Facebook sort of got a sneaky on us, really, because it was such good stuff. Nobody kind of was asked or noticed that actually, they were collecting stuff about you and making money out of it. Now, the interesting thing for me has been that Apple, which is not highly relevant for Africa, but Apple has said, do you want your data to be collected? I've said no. And actually, Facebook revenues have gone down as a result of that. So, Apple users have, in some number, in a sense, gone out from there. I think the other thing that is kind of interesting, and it's uncertain how it will play out, is that, for example, MTN has launched a social platform called Ayoba, and it's beginning to gain some traction, not yet enough traction, but some traction. And if you had a social platform which was regional and local, then maybe there would be some greater degree of control over how the data was used and, in a sense, what it was used for.
So Mfanafuchi Sitebe says, please expand a bit on the negative impact on the tax base and something new, the declining postal services. So we'll maybe just try and keep these responses short because there may be quite a few questions.
Okay. I think the negative impact of tax, I can only really repeat what I said earlier. the more you tax the thing that you want to provide cheap services, the less easy it is to get cheap services. Postal services, I know very little about, so I won't even attempt to answer that question.
All right, I'll make a very quick comment.
Yeah.
And that is that in the last couple of years, 3 to 4 years, postal services has just become a digital business like any other digital business. And if we look across the continent, in fact, we did a little review, just a scan of postal services in the SADC region countries who are doing absolutely fascinating things, all of which are really taking postal services beyond the analog. You know, you can get, and there's lots of e-commerce actually in the postal service, including in countries like Angola and Tanzania. So, going just way beyond, just breaking the boundaries of postal services. Then Sami Sali from Sudan says, do you have any study or report comparing the contribution of the local versus foreign telecom operator investments in African society welfare? Quick comment.
Yeah, very quick comment. I think that the amount of money put in by international companies is always going to be a great deal larger than that put in by local shareholders, because the amount of money in different African countries for the purpose of investing is quite small, quite modest, really, alongside international capital. The second part of your question is about the welfare that derives from that. And I think that, again, you would have to say that the international element of that capital generated far more welfare than probably the local part did. That would have to be a guess, because I don't think I've ever seen a report that looks at it in quite the way you've posed the question.
Perhaps a few more. That wraps up what's on the chat for now, but the online audience, please feel free to raise your hand or put more questions in the chat. And for the moment, let's come back to the audience here in Parktown. Any questions? Yes, please go ahead. Come and take a seat. Tell us your name.
Hi, Kimira, I'm a public policy consultant.
Hi.
Haven't read the book yet, but very keen to. You charted the shift from the traditional mobile operator over this period of time and how it's fundamentally changed in form, nature, and behavior. I'm interested in maybe what's been the most interesting development for you to have witnessed with our regulators or the legislative space. Are they keeping pace with this shift in creature? We now have, telco going into techco, fintech, broadcasting, content generation, payments, and this is inviting a lot more scrutiny across the regulatory landscape. You're not just talking about communications, you're talking about a whole host of new issues, including human rights. And a quick response, adopting good digital rights, human rights toolkits and implementing them would be a great idea, but we need that will to come from the industry. But,
I think that you in a sense, to some extent, answered all your own question. That shift that is happening to a platform economy means that the regulators who are designed to deal with telcos, to deal with ISPs, are really at a disadvantage, because most of the power in terms of international tech companies lies elsewhere. There's a very interesting case going on in Nigeria at the moment where the local regulator is suing Facebook for some issue to do with advertising. It doesn't really matter what it is, but that is the exception rather than the rule. To actually redo what regulators look like would be a major piece of reform. And I was very amused because we did a big session at AfricaCom on the book with Andile Nkaba and Funke Peka, who runs one of the big cables in Nigeria, and Nick Rudnick, who runs Liquid Telecom, and a woman called Nika Naghavi from MSS Africa. And Andile was saying provocatively, but also probably with some reality, what you need is an enabling agency. What you have at the moment is something that polices. And how do we get to a situation where we can have an independent agency encourage the good things to happen, whilst paying attention to all of the things you're talking about? Now, one of the Achilles heels of regulators has always been that they were set up to deal with two sets of interests. The industry, because the industry had to make money, and the consumer, because the consumer had to be protected from the industry in some ways, so they didn't make too much money. Now, these issues are all still there, but the consumer side of what regulators tend to do is much less well developed. Nobody, I mean, it's probably happening now, but nobody is sitting down in a regulator at the moment and saying, what are the implications of AI, machine learning? I suspect nobody is sitting down in a regulator and saying, you know, what are the issues arising from digital services and digital content? Some of it makes me fearful, because actually some of it's to do with digital content. And, you know, kind of the temptation is always to provide more rules and more control. But on the other hand, things like hate speech are very real and have very difficult consequences. But what you were saying about digital toolbooks and all of that, my long engagement with regulators makes me feel that, again, all the rational stuff is quite right, but there has to be some fundamental mind shift. There has to be some moment where people say, yeah, we need to do this differently. And the French regulator now has, you know, digital quite central to its mission and all of that. I think the UK regulator, though it remains a quite traditional regulator, has lots of stuff in there that's to do with digital. So it'll come.
Maybe two quick comments from my side, because I'm particularly fascinated by this part of the conversation. The one point is that from the very early days of telecoms regulation, when people like Bill Melody were writing, you know, about what are regulators supposed to do, innovation, focusing on innovation, not regulating innovation, but enabling or unleashing or creating a regulatory environment within which innovation could prosper. It's written in black and white.
Yes.
And yet, for 2 decades, or is it 3 decades? 2 decades.
2 decades at least, yeah.
Regulators have spectacularly missed that boat.
Yeah,
and it's just curious why.
I think the good example is TV white spaces, because actually TV white spaces could provide all sorts of interesting advantages, but every regulator has been kind of hamstrung by vested interests of one kind or another. And access to spectrum and opening up access to spectrum, how you get innovation that will help provide for coverage in rural areas, all of these things. And in a way, there's a part of me thinks that government agencies, unless it's an it's called an innovation agency, is probably not going to be the place to start. So, you know, somewhere, somehow. But this thing that Andile was talking about of enabling, I think is quite right, because actually, if you look at the history of spectrum here in South Africa and the amount of time it's taken to get to the spectrum auction, and the world moves on. You know, the world is moving, you know, kind of much faster than that. So you have government time and you have business time, and they're not the same thing.
Please come and take a seat. There's a question, a hand. Yes, we'll get to Posa in a moment.
I've got a comment to what you just said, as well as another question. So around the role of the regulator, right? And I guess to what you also mentioned, I think there is a need now for a separate dedicated entity that actually looks at it. Because I mean, if you look at it, regulation in its nature is about policing. And I think we've created this, I'd say it's an unfair expectation on regulators to actually enable any form of. Because at the end of the day, how it's structured is you've got industry that does whatever it's doing, and regulators are there to follow, sweeping up and making sure that, you know, they're doing the right work. So I think what's starting to happen, especially in the data space, right, because data is becoming so complex, it needs, you know, both policing and enablement, where you've got these data agencies, like the data authorities, right,
information regulators.
And their role is actually a mix of both policing and enabling. And I think if the rest of the aspects of this new era would follow that, I think we're actually in the right direction. The regulators be left to policing. I think that's what they're good at. And then we start looking, how can we expand on that way? That was my comment. But my question is around what what you're talking about earlier around, now we moved from money and now we're getting into. So I want to get your view. Is now we're going to fintech, which is really like, it's growing and it's growing big, right? We've seen, entities like MTN also, that's the way they actually say, you know what, we are great. It's almost being carved out as a separate business. Same thing, this is standalone, its own, etc., etc. Now, when we look at where we're going with, fintech, in your view, is it going to be a telco-led revolution, given that, they've been holding money cap?
Yeah.
Or is it something that we can expect to see the FNBs of this world actually starting to drive? And where is that sweet spot where we can say, okay, we've got the telcos who've done phenomenal things. We've got the banks who have held their own, some of them, in trying to drive this new age financial services aspect. Where is that sweet spot? So is it telco or banks, or where is that sweet spot?
It's a great question. And I think the mobile operators have finally got the memo. And the memo is about the change to digital, what is usually summed up in the dreadful phrase digital transformation. Now, if they are going to go from being telcos to techcos, what does that look like? And it doesn't look like probably anything that is there now. Actually, it looks like probably a group of people enabling a platform which can help everybody in the room do all the things they want to do. So it's not about saying, but you can't, your data runs out at the end of the month and, I'm sorry, it's a wet Wednesday, I have to charge you twice as much. It's to do with being able to say, yeah, you want to do that, great, come, let's have a conversation about it. And the underlying thing is the data. Now, if that's the case, then we're envisaging a world which is very, very different. Now, the thing about finance is nobody wants, I suspect, a world in which it is unregulated. There are parts of Bitcoin, not least its energy usage and its, constant relationship with scams of one kind or another that kind of appall me. So some level of regulation, but what is a bank? If you think about a bank in a digital world, a bank is just a piece of software that we all trust. And 9 times out of 10, maybe more than that, we're right. So in this world in which sort of everything solid melts into air, what is this new world going to look like? And I'm going to leave you with that question.
Yes.
Because actually that is another long conversation.
Yes, but I'm going to bring you back just for a moment as we end. But before we end, Posa, please go ahead. Posa will be the last speaker from the online and from the floor, because we are heading straight into the time at which Russell will need to leave for the airport, because we don't need him to miss his flight. Very sorry about that. So Posa, please ask your question.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Lucy, for organizing this important seminar. And I also thank Russell for the information that he gave us. This is very, very helpful. My question is in relation to online content. In our country, we do have what we call prohibited content that must not be streamed online. For example, propaganda for war, 2, incitement of imminent violence, 3, hate speech, and 4, child pornography. So how will you advise the regulatory authority that is tasked with the mandate of ensuring that this prohibited content is not streamed in the country, so that we can make sure that our children are not consuming adult content, but consume that content while they are big enough to can consume it? So what must the regulatory authority do to make sure that prohibited content is not streamed online? Thank you.
I think you have 2 kinds of cultural issues. One is content that all of us, wherever we are, whatever culture we come from, will generally speaking agree is not a good thing. Child pornography is one of those categories. And then you have another set of categories, which are to do with things that are culturally negotiable. And those are the things that I find myself most uncomfortable with in this discussion, because actually, if there's content that is to do with people being gay or lesbian, or if there is content that is to do with comments on the president, all of those kinds of things, those in a way are culturally negotiable, and that is a much more difficult area. And I think if you look at the stuff that we all agree on, then actually the rules are there. People have got ways of doing it. It's not always successful, but the rules are there. The more difficult thing is what I call the culturally negotiable content, and I don't have an easy answer to that. I am by nature somebody who would like the maximum amount of free expression, but I'm also old enough to know that free expression, my free expression, is not necessarily your free expression.
Well, thank you very much to Russell. Thank you very much to the audience here on the Wits Parktown campus, to the audience online. And I think that...
and thank you, Lucy, for arranging.
It's a great pleasure. My kind of last thought was, and I'm happy to hear a comment from you, Russell. You called the book Africa 2.0. But really, we're in, I don't buy into the 4IR terminology by any means, but we've been with 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0, and we would probably say that we're now in a world of, we pretty much, there are parts of Africa that are pretty much in Africa 4.0. So when is the next book coming out?
I probably won't be alive in 35 years' time.
All
so.
right. Okay, then we'll let you off the hook.
And I leave that to an African to write.
Very good. Yeah. Excellent idea. Well, thank you very much, everyone, audience and author alike. Sadly, for those of you online, we can't offer you any food and drink, but there is a little bit, there are some snacks just in the room opposite before you head off into the Friday evening.